The Korean War, what happened before and after. Korean War, which happened in the Korean Peninsula in the 1950s, is the only war that China and American military forces had a confrontation. About this war, most topics focus on the war itself. Who attacked first, who lost more soldiers, who won more battles, how many times the ownership of Pyongyang and Seoul had been changed, the Incheon landing from General Douglas MacArthur, the unexpected intervention from China and the huge casualties. Today what we will talk about is not about the war itself, but about what happened before and after. Korean War has been called as the Forgotten War. Before or after, it seems nothing changed. The 38th parallel was still 38th parallel. The government in the north or the south are still the same ones as before. But this war, which cost more than 1 million soldiers' lives together from all the participating parties, and even more civilian lives from South and North Korea, has much more facts deserves a discussion. What happened before the war? The Korean War began on June 25, 1950, when North Korean troops stormed across the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. Soon, almost occupied 90% of the land and 92% of the population. In September 1950, an amphibious UN counteroffensive was launched at Incheon and cut off many North Korean troops in South Korea. Soon almost pushed the North Korean army back to the border of China and Korea. On October 25, 1950, Chinese forces under the name of People's Volunteer Army, PVA, crossed the Yalu River and entered the war. 3 years later, 1953, July 27th, Korean Armistice Agreement was signed. The war ended. This simple description has mainly losing ends. Why there is the 38th parallel? Why did North Korea invade South Korea? And why South Korea could not arrange any decent defense before the Americans involved? Why the US must help South Korea? Why China sent troops there? Whether this war can be avoided? Let's go through this one by one. Why there is a 38th parallel which split Korea? Everything started with Japan. For centuries in history, Korea had been a unified political entity. In history, Korea had been invaded by Japan for 3 times. The first 2 times Japan failed. One of the reasons was, in the ancient time, China always treated Korea under China's protection, so always sent troops to Korea when Japan attacked. The 3rd time, which was at the end of the 20th century, after the Meiji Restoration, Japan became the first industrialized country in Asia. And this time, Japan won, not only against Korea, but also against China and Russia. After the Sino-Japanese War 1895 and the Russo-Japanese War 1905, Korea was peeled off from China's protection, and then in 1910 merged with Japan, became a Japanese colony. But until then, Korea was still unified. 1945, Japan lost World War II, but not to Korea. The division of Korea began at the end of World War II in 1945, with the occupation of Korea by the Allied forces that defeated Japan. According to an understanding reached between the United States and the Soviet Union in the last days of the war, Soviet troops would occupy the parts of Korea north of the 38th parallel, and the US troops would occupy those south of this dividing line. Everything happened so suddenly that Korea themselves had not accepted that while Japan lost the war, but Korea was the one who had been split. From the north, Kim Il-sung consolidated his position as the leader of Soviet-occupied Northern Korea, established the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in North on September 9, 1948. In their constitution, their capital was set up in Seoul, which is also the capital city of South Korea. North Korea kept Seoul as their capital in the constitution until the 1980s, 30 years after the end of the Korean War, when they finally accepted the truth. In the South, the American-backed Lee Sung-man established the Republic of Korea on August 15, 1948. Lee Sung-man won the president position by election, but actually he was a dictator. According to the American President Truman's memory, although the Americans don't like Lee Soo-man very much, we have no choice but to support Lee Soo-man. The newly built South Korea at that time was quite far away from a reasonable democratic country like what they are today. From then on, Korea has been split into the North and the South, similar to the situation of the East and West German, with the borderline 38th parallel. Why did North Korea attack the South and did crush the South at the beginning of the war? This division of Korea, after more than a millennium of being unified, was controversial and temporary by both South and North Korean regimes. Border clashes soon broke out between the two Koreas, each of which claimed sovereignty over the entire peninsula. Both pushed the army to the border, and blood incidents happened nearly every day. In the beginning, when the US and the Soviet Union still could talk, their goal was together searching for a solution for unified Korea. But with the relationship between the US and the Soviet Union broke up in Europe, and the Cold War started, the communication and the cooperation stopped. Even though the US and the Soviet Union did not want to trigger or involve in any kind of war in the Korean peninsula, the attention and the contest between them was majorly located in Europe. Korea was not any party's priority, and a war in the Korean peninsula would only worsen the situation. The World War II had just finished a few years ago. Anything that could trigger World War III would only be a trouble. This was what in the US and the Soviet Union's mind about the situation in Korea at that time. For this reason, the Soviet Union and the US both withdrew their troops from Korea between 1947 to 1949. However, maybe because the division for Korean themselves was quite reluctant, both the South and the North governments threatened that they will unify Korea by force. In 1949, Kim Il-sung spent quite a lot of time persuading the Soviet and China to support him to unify Korea. In the South, Lee Soo-man clamoring all the time to unify North Korea by force, and even tried to persuade the US to send the military back to the peninsula. The difference was the support they got from the Soviet Union and the US were quite unbalanced. When the US withdrew from South Korea, they already knew Lee Soo-man wanted was to unify Korea by force, but they did not support this idea. Although by the time of withdrawal, US already helped South Korea build an equipped armed force, but they didn't give Lee Soo-man any offensive weapon that would be adequate to initiate the attack to the north. In the meantime, the support that Kim Il-sung got from the Soviet Union was much better. The number of South Korean troops was 98,000 at that time, built by the United States in a hastily half a year before the withdrawal. The North Korean army had about 135,000 soldiers, well trained and organized. In terms of equipment, the North over South had 4 times more cannons and almost 3 times mortars above 81 mm. In terms of strategy, North Korea had a military advisory group from the Soviet Union. In the South, although Lee Soo-man had been clamoring for the unification of North Korea by force, in fact, no mention that the US did not support him. Even himself had done nothing of any preparations. Therefore, North Korea, with its superiority in numbers and the disciplines of soldiers, equipment, better preparation for the war, and with the acquiescence of the Soviet Union, on June 25, 1950, it crossed the 38th parallel and fought an undeclared war against South Korea. By now, it is not so difficult to understand why North Korea was the one who initiated the war, and once the war broke out, South Korea would be collapsed so quickly. Why did America join the war? If South Korea did not collapse so quickly at the beginning of the war, if they could organize some proper defense, America did not need to be involved directly. On June 30th, after returning from an inspection at the Korean War, MacArthur, the supreme commander of U.S. Allied forces in Japan, reported that Lee Soo-man's troops had completely lost the ability to counterattack. The only hope for holding the front line south of Seoul is to send U.S. ground forces into the Korean combat area. In Asia, the Republic of China government, backed by the United States, just lost the Chinese Civil War and retreated to Taiwan. China mainland was a red regime backed by the Soviet Union. Japan was in the early post-war period and was only 50 kilometers away from the Korean peninsula by the sea. If there was no South Korea as a buffer zone, Free Japan would be surrounded all by communist countries. Therefore, although Korea was not the United States' priority at that time, once North Korea had the possibility of controlling the entire peninsula, the United States had no choices but to help Lee Soo-man. Why did China join the war? The People's Republic of China, the Communist China, was built just 1 year ago after 4 years of civil war. Most countries had not recognized this new government yet. It was not a perfect time to directly face the U.S. Army, which was the world's strongest military force that just won World War II. In fact, at that time, what China concerned was not whether Korea was unified or not, but whether the Soviet Union would help China to unify Taiwan. However, Kim Il-sung thought he had his agreement with the Soviet Union and did not care what China's opinion. When US landed in Incheon, North Korea collapsed immediately in front of the UN forces. And the Soviet Union did not want to send troops to directly meet US Army. The new-built Communist China, which still very much relied on the Soviet Union, did not have much choice when Stalin sent the request. What did the Soviet Union do? From all the parties, the Soviet Union was the only one who did not directly be involved in the war, but they played an important role from the beginning to the end. Soviet Union's attitude changed with a very critical timeline. In the beginning, they totally against any war in the peninsula. However, they changed to acquiescence Kim Il-sung to cross the 38th parallel. Then persuaded China to be the proxy to fight in Korea and back up China with weapons and air force. Just after the war broke, the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution on June 27, recommending that its members provide military assistance to South Korea. In the United Nations meeting, the Soviet Union could veto this resolution, and the United Nations did send the invitation of such an important meeting to the Soviet Union. However, at that time, the Soviet Union was protesting the American-supported Taiwan-based Republic of China seat in the United Nations, so they refused to attend any meeting since January 1950. This war lasted for 3 years and caused huge casualties to all parties involved. Did the participating parties achieve their original goals? We will analyze in detail in the next episode.